A single phrase whispered in the opulent silence of a Manhattan restaurant brought an empire to its knees. It didn't come from a rival CEO or a government regulator. It came from a waitress holding a declined credit card, a woman the world had already written off. The man she spoke to was Lachlan Sterling, a corporate predator on the verge of closing the deal of a lifetime, a hostile takeover worth $800 million. He saw her as nothing more than furniture, a ghost in an apron. He never imagined that this ghost remembered a name he had buried long ago, and that her memory was about to cost him everything. The air in the gilded quill was thick with the scent of old money and new ambition. It was a fragrance Nina Petrova knew well, a complex blend of truffle oil, aged leather, and the faint metallic tang of desperation that clung to the edges of power. From her vantage point near the service station, she watched the city's titans play their games across tables draped in heavy Belgian linen. She was a silent observer, a professional phantom whose job was to remain invisible while anticipating every need. Her crisp black uniform was a suit of armor, her polite smile a shield. Few of the patrons who looked through her ever guessed that 3 years ago, she had been one of them. Not a billionaire, but a rising star on Wall Street, a senior risk analyst whose projections were gospel until she became the scapegoat for a collapse engineered by men far more powerful than herself. Now her world was one of polished silver and hushed conversations, a constant reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. Each clink of a wine glass, each low chuckle over a successful negotiation, was a small twist of a knife in a wound that refused to heal. But Nina was a survivor. She had learned to channel her bitterness into a meticulous, almost obsessive focus on her work. She knew which patrons preferred their water with a slice of lime versus lemon, who took their espresso with a single unrefined sugar cube, and which CEOs were on the verge of a merger by the brand of scotch they ordered. Tonight, her attention was fixed on table 7, the most coveted booth in the restaurant, nestled in a secluded alcove with a commanding view of Central Park's glittering evening display. The table was occupied by 2 men who represented the opposite poles of the financial universe. The first was Lachlan Sterling. Even sitting down, Sterling radiated a restless, predatory energy. His suit was a razor-sharp Tom Ford, his watch a Patek Philippe that cost more than Nina's entire college education. His face was all sharp angles and calculated charisma, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, constantly scanning, assessing, and consuming. He was the quintessential corporate raider, the founder and CEO of Sterling Global Acquisitions, a firm notorious for buying legacy companies, gutting them for their assets, and leaving thousands unemployed in their wake. He moved with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never been told no, and truly believed he deserved it. Tonight, he was radiating a particular brand of triumphalism, the aura of a king on the eve of a great conquest. His dining companion was the antithesis of Sterling's aggressive modernity. Robert Harrington was old money, the kind that whispered rather than shouted. As the third-generation chairman of Kennardine Industries, a respected manufacturing conglomerate founded by his grandfather, Harrington was a pillar of corporate integrity. His suit was a classic, impeccably tailored Savile Row creation that had likely been in style for 30 years and would be for 30 more. He was in his late 70s with a full head of silver hair and a quiet dignity that seemed immune to Sterling's high-voltage charm. Kennardine was Harrington's life's work, a company known for its innovation, its loyal employees, and its deep roots in the communities where it operated. It was also, as Nina knew from the furtive whispers in the financial press, vulnerable. This was the final dinner, the last push. Nina could feel it. For weeks, the city had been buzzing with rumors of Sterling's audacious, unsolicited bid for Kennardine. He was offering an astronomical sum, $800 million, and the board was wavering. The decision, everyone knew, would ultimately rest on Harrington's shoulders. He was the company's heart and soul, its largest individual shareholder. If he agreed to the sale, it was over. Think of it, Robert. Sterling's voice sliced through the restaurant's low hum. He leaned forward, his polished cufflinks catching the light. It's not an end. It's a liberation. For you and for the company. No more legacy costs, no more pension obligations weighing you down. We streamline. We optimize for the future. Nina, refilling their water glasses with practiced stealth, flinched internally. She knew Sterling's vocabulary. Streamline meant mass layoffs. Optimize meant selling off divisions. Liberation meant a slow, painful death for a company that had provided stable livelihoods for generations. Harrington took a slow sip of his wine, a 1982 Chateau Margaux that Sterling had ordered with a theatrical flourish. His expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of polite consideration. Our pension obligations, as you call them, Lachlan, are promises. Promises I made to men and women who gave their lives to building Kennardine. They are not merely numbers on a balance sheet. Of course, Sterling said, his smile never faltering. It was a brilliant, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. And we will honor them, to the letter of the law. But the market has changed. You need to be lean, agile. Kennardine is a noble lion, but it's carrying too much weight. I'm offering to make it a cheetah, swift, deadly, profitable. Nina felt a cold dread creep up her spine. The cheetah analogy was apt. A beautiful killer that devoured its prey and moved on without a backward glance. She remembered the day her own career was devoured. The name of the firm that had orchestrated the hostile takeover of her company, that had used shell corporations and fraudulent accounting to bankrupt it before picking its bones clean, was seared into her memory. They had moved like a cheetah too, and the fallout had been devastating. She'd lost her job, her savings, her reputation. She'd been forced to sell her apartment and move into a tiny studio in a less than desirable neighborhood, all while trying to cover her mother's mounting medical bills. She retreated from the table, her hands steady but her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched the two men from a distance. The conversation continued, with Sterling driving the narrative, a torrent of buzzwords and financial projections designed to overwhelm and impress. Harrington listened, his hands steepled in front of him, asking few questions, but listening with an intensity that missed nothing. The restaurant's manager, a perpetually stressed Frenchman named Jean-Pierre Dubois, caught her eye and gave a subtle nod toward table 7. The message was clear. They were VIPs. Perfection was the only acceptable standard. Nina nodded back, her face a neutral mask. Dubois had no idea that she understood the conversation at that table better than he ever could. He saw a billionaire in his target. She saw a wolf and a shepherd, with the fate of an entire flock hanging in the balance. As the main courses were cleared, Sterling clapped his hands together, a gesture of finality. So, Robert, we have an agreement. My final offer stands. Generous, I think we can both agree. We sign the preliminary papers tomorrow, and you can finally enjoy that retirement you so richly deserve. Think of it. No more board meetings. Just you, a golf course, and a very, very healthy bank account. Harrington remained silent for a long moment, studying the younger man. Nina held her breath. The entire restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving only the tableau at table 7. This was the moment, the decision that would alter the lives of thousands of people. Finally, Harrington gave a slow, deliberate nod. The offer is compelling, Lachlan. The board is convinced of its financial merits. I will admit, you have been most persuasive. A triumphant gleam flashed in Sterling's eyes. He had him. He had won. He raised his glass. To the future, and to a profitable new chapter for Kennardine. Harrington raised his own glass, but his eyes were shadowed with a deep, weary sadness. To the future, he echoed, his voice barely a whisper. As Nina watched Sterling's shark-like smile widen, a wave of nauseating helplessness washed over her. It was happening again. Another good company, another legacy, was about to be fed to the wolves of Wall Street, and she was just a waitress, pouring water, destined to watch it all unfold from the sidelines, invisible and powerless. The dessert course was a masterpiece of culinary art, a deconstructed tiramisu served in a chilled glass, with clouds of espresso foam and delicate chocolate shards. It was meant to be a celebration, a sweet final note to seal a monumental deal. For Lachlan Sterling, it was a victory lap. He regaled Harrington with tales of his corporate conquests, each story more audacious than the last. He spoke of leverage, of synergy, of shareholder value, a litany of sanitized terms for human disruption. Nina moved around the table with the quiet efficiency of a ghost, clearing the plates. She had trained herself to filter out the noise of the dining room, to focus only on the task at hand. But tonight, her old analyst instincts were firing on all cylinders. She couldn't shut it off. The words and phrases floating from table 7 were not just background noise. They were data points, puzzle pieces clicking into a horrifyingly familiar picture. The beauty of it is the structure, Sterling was saying, gesturing expansively with his fork. We're calling it Project Chimera. We'll use a tiered acquisition vehicle, financed through a consortium of private equity partners. It minimizes our direct exposure and maximizes tax efficiency. It's a work of art. Project Chimera. The name sent a jolt through Nina, cold and electric. A chimera, a mythical creature made of disparate parts. It was a fitting name for a plan to dismember a company. Harrington, for his part, looked less than enthused by the technical jargon. It all sounds terribly complex, Lachlan. Complexity is where the profit is hidden, Robert, Sterling chuckled. We keep the core assets, the patents, the real estate, under a new holding company. The manufacturing divisions, the ones with the, let's call them, legacy employee structures, we can spin those off. Sell them to a third party. They'll handle the restructuring. Nina felt her blood run cold. She knew exactly what that meant. The third party would be a shell company created for the sole purpose of declaring bankruptcy, thereby nullifying union contracts and pension agreements. The workers would be left with nothing. It was a brutal but legal maneuver, a loophole in corporate law large enough to drive a fleet of armored trucks through. It was the exact same playbook that had destroyed her old firm. She lingered for a fraction of a second too long while refilling Harrington's water, her mind racing. She needed to get away, to breathe, but she was rooted to the spot, compelled to listen. And our lead partner on the financing side is top tier, Sterling continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, impressive tone. An old associate of mine, brilliant fellow, runs a boutique firm now, highly specialized. You wouldn't have heard of them. Bridgewater Capital. The name hit Nina with the force of a physical blow. Bridgewater Capital. The world around her tilted, the low murmur of the restaurant fading to a dull roar in her ears. The water pitcher in her hand felt impossibly heavy. Bridgewater Capital. It wasn't just a similar playbook, it was the same people. They were the architects of her ruin, the faceless entity that had appeared from nowhere, bought out her company's debt, forced it into bankruptcy, and vanished with the most valuable assets, leaving thousands of employees, including her, in the lurch. Her boss, a good man named Richard, had been utterly destroyed, losing his home, his reputation, and ultimately his health. Nina had been his top analyst, and the smear campaign had painted her as complicit, a reckless young hotshot whose faulty models had led to the collapse. The accusation was baseless, but in the chaos, mud stuck. She was blacklisted, rendered unemployable in the world she had dedicated her life to. She could suddenly picture the deposition room, the cold, condescending faces of Bridgewater's lawyers. She remembered the shame, the rage, the feeling of her future being erased line by line in a legal document. She had spent the last 3 years trying to bury that name, to forget the trauma. And here it was, being spoken with casual pride by the man who was about to do it all over again. Her hand trembled slightly, and a single drop of water splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth. Sterling's gaze snapped to her, his eyes narrowing with irritation. It was the first time he had truly looked at her all night. "Careful," he said, his voice sharp and dismissive. "My apologies, sir," Nina murmured, her voice tight. She quickly dabbed the spot with a napkin, her movements automatic while her mind was a maelstrom. She retreated to the service station, her back to the dining room, and leaned against the cold marble counter, fighting for breath. Her mind was a whirlwind of connections. Sterling, Project Chimera, Bridgewater Capital. It was all there, a pattern, a history of destruction repeating itself. She looked back at Harrington. The old man looked exhausted, like he was surrendering not just his company, but a part of his soul. He didn't see the truth. He saw an aggressive but successful businessman offering an undeniable fortune. He didn't know he was shaking hands with the devil, a devil who used different masks but always played the same cruel game. For a moment, a wild, desperate impulse surged through her. She should say something. Walk over there and tell Harrington exactly who Lachlan Sterling was partnering with. Tell him what Bridgewater Capital did to her company, to her colleagues, to her life. But what could she possibly say? Excuse me, Mr. Harrington, I'm your waitress, and I have some unsolicited advice on your $800 million corporate merger. They would have her thrown out before she finished the sentence. She was nobody, a ghost in an apron, her word against a billionaire's. It was a fantasy. The check arrived. Sterling, beaming, took the leather billfold from the Maitre d'. He didn't even glance at the total. For a man about to close an $800 million deal, a few $1,000s for dinner was pocket change. It was a rounding error. He exuded an air of absolute, unassailable financial power. He slid a sleek black credit card from his wallet. It was an exclusive invitation-only card, crafted from anodized titanium, a symbol. He placed it in the folder with a flourish and handed it to Jean-Pierre, who accepted it with a reverential bow before passing it to Nina to be processed. "It has been a pleasure, Robert," Sterling said, rising slightly from his seat to shake Harrington's hand. "A historic evening." "Indeed," Harrington replied, his voice heavy with resignation. Nina walked toward the point-of-sale terminal at the back of the restaurant, the cold, heavy card in her hand. It felt like a token of evil. Each step was a countdown. In a few moments, the transaction would be complete. Sterling and Harrington would leave. The deal would be signed tomorrow. Thousands of lives would be irrevocably altered, and she would go on polishing silver, forever a spectator to the wreckage. She reached the terminal, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and swiped the titanium card through the reader. The machine whirred for a moment, communicating with the vast, invisible networks of global finance. And then, a small, quiet beep. On the screen in stark red letters, a single word appeared: declined. For a long second, Nina simply stared at the screen. The word pulsed with a malevolent energy, a digital stop sign in the path of an unstoppable force. Declined. It didn't make sense. The card was a centurion, the kind of card that supposedly had no limit, a key that unlocked the world for the planet's financial elite. For it to be declined was not just an inconvenience. It was an impossibility, a glitch in the very fabric of the reality men like Lachlan Sterling inhabited. She swiped it again, slower this time, making sure the magnetic strip was perfectly aligned. The machine whirred. The same quiet beep, the same glaring red letters. Declined. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. This was bad. This was the kind of situation that could get a waitress fired. Jean-Pierre would have a fit. She could feel his anxious gaze from across the room. She was supposed to be invisible, seamless. A declined card was a tear in the fabric of service, a loud, awkward snag in the smooth performance of luxury. She glanced over at table 7. Sterling was laughing at something, his head thrown back, the picture of a man on top of the world. Harrington was watching him, his expression one of weary contemplation. The moment was fragile, the deal hanging by the thread of this final, convivial evening. Nina's training screamed at her to be discreet. The protocol was to quietly return to the table, lean in, and murmur to the host, "Sir, it seems we're having some trouble with the terminal. Do you perhaps have another form of payment?" It was a dance of etiquette designed to minimize embarrassment. But as she stood there, the cold, useless card in her hand, something else began to stir within her. The shock, the anger, the resurrected trauma of Bridgewater Capital. The sight of that word, declined, was more than just a technical error. It was a crack, a tiny hairline fracture in the flawless, diamond-hard facade of Lachlan Sterling. It was a sign of imperfection, a whisper that perhaps the man who projected absolute financial omnipotence was not as invincible as he appeared. Her analyst's brain, dormant for 3 years, roared back to life. A card like this doesn't get declined for being over a trivial dinner limit. It gets declined for one of 2 reasons: a catastrophic system-wide banking failure, which was unlikely, or a flag, a major system-level flag placed on the account holder's entire portfolio. A liquidity freeze, a margin call, a sudden, massive seizure of assets. The whispers she had overheard earlier, tiered acquisition vehicle, private equity partners, minimizes direct exposure, suddenly took on a new sinister meaning. These were all terms for creating leverage, borrowing immense sums of money against other assets to finance a takeover. Sterling wasn't just buying Kennardine, he was gambling. And if his card was declined, it could mean that somewhere, deep in the hidden plumbing of the financial world, his gamble had just been called. A plan, audacious and terrifying, began to form in her mind. It was a long shot, a wild, career-ending, life-altering risk. But it was a chance. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she turned and walked back toward the table. She ignored the frantic, questioning look from Jean-Pierre. She bypassed the standard, discreet protocol. She did not lean in. She did not whisper. She stopped beside the table, positioning herself so that she was addressing Sterling, but was in clear view of Harrington. She held the black titanium card between her thumb and forefinger. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through his laughter. It was not loud, but it was firm enough to command attention. Sterling turned, his smile fading into a look of annoyance at the interruption. "What is it?" "There appears to be a problem with your card, sir," Nina said, placing it on the table next to his wine glass. She made sure the side with his name was facing up. It was declined. Silence. A deep, profound silence fell over the alcove. The word hung in the air, ugly and obscene. For a man like Lachlan Sterling, this was the equivalent of being publicly stripped naked. It wasn't about the money, it was about the power. His power had just been questioned, publicly, by a waitress. Sterling's face went through a rapid series of transformations. First, shock, then disbelief. Finally, it settled into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. His charm evaporated, revealing the cold, reptilian predator beneath. "What did you say?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "It was declined, sir," Nina repeated, meeting his gaze without flinching. Her heart was a hummingbird trapped in her chest, but her voice remained even. "That's impossible," Sterling snapped. "That card has no limit. Run it again. Your machine is broken." "I ran it twice, sir," Nina replied calmly. "The machine is working perfectly for all other transactions this evening." Sterling's face flushed a dark, mottled red. He was being contradicted, challenged. He snatched the card off the table. "Give me the bill. This is ridiculous, an outrage." He began fumbling in his wallet for another card, his movements jerky and agitated. The image of effortless control he had so carefully cultivated all evening was shattering before Robert Harrington's eyes. Harrington watched the scene unfold with a quiet, unnerving stillness. His gaze shifted from Sterling's flustered rage to Nina's composed demeanor. He was an old-school businessman, a man who believed that character was revealed not in success, but in moments of pressure. And Sterling was cracking under the slightest amount of it. "Perhaps it's a simple mistake, Lachlan," Harrington said, his tone neutral. "It's not a mistake. It's incompetence." Sterling shot back, his anger now directed at Nina. "I'll have your job for this embarrassment." The threat hung in the air. Nina felt a flicker of fear, but it was quickly extinguished by a cold, hard resolve. She had already lost one career to men like him. What was one more job? This was the moment. The fracture was open. She had to strike. As Lachlan Sterling continued to fumble through his wallet, his composure shredded, the quiet alcove at table 7 became the focal point of an invisible storm. The air was electric with humiliation and dawning suspicion. Robert Harrington's silence was more damning than any accusation. He was observing, analyzing, reevaluating the man to whom he was about to entrust his family's legacy. He was seeing for the first time not the confident titan of industry, but a flustered man whose foundation seemed to be crumbling over the price of a dinner. Sterling finally produced another card, a platinum one this time, and thrust it at Nina. "Try this one, and be quick about it." His voice was a low growl, laced with venom. He was trying to regain control, to brush the incident aside as a mere annoyance. But Nina didn't take the card. She simply stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. Now was the time. The opening she had seen, the wild, desperate plan, was coalescing into a single, devastating move. She had to reframe the narrative. This wasn't about a declined card. It was about what the declined card signified. She took a small, deliberate breath. She looked past Sterling, her eyes meeting Harrington's directly. She needed him to hear this. She needed to plant the seed of doubt in the only mind that mattered. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to his barely controlled rage. "Perhaps it's not an issue with the card itself." Sterling froze, his hand still outstretched. "What are you babbling about?" Nina held Harrington's gaze. "Perhaps your assets are a bit over-leveraged?" The word hung in the air between them, precise and deadly. It was not the word a waitress should know. It was a term from his world, from the boardrooms and the trading floors. It was an analyst's word. The effect was instantaneous. Sterling's angry bluster faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock, and something else, a sliver of fear. Harrington's eyebrows rose slightly. He leaned forward, his full attention now fixed on Nina. The tired, resigned old man was gone, replaced by the shrewd, calculating chairman who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of corporate America for 50 years. Nina pressed her advantage, her voice gaining confidence. "It happens," she continued, a faint, ironic edge to her tone. "When you're trying to finance a major acquisition, sometimes the lenders get nervous. They tighten the credit lines unexpectedly." She paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering the killing blow. "Especially when dealing with complex financial vehicles, shell corporations, for instance, like the ones Bridgewater Capital used to use." The name landed like a grenade in the quiet alcove. Lachlan Sterling's face went white. All the color drained from it, leaving a pasty, waxen mask. The fury, the arrogance, the charisma. It all vanished, replaced by the raw, primal terror of a man who has just heard a ghost whisper his name. He stared at Nina, truly seeing her for the first time, and in her eyes he saw not a servant, but a judge. Harrington's expression shifted from curiosity to intense, focused alarm. "Bridgewater Capital?" he repeated, the name unfamiliar to him, but Nina's delivery had given it a venomous weight. "What about them?" Before Sterling could recover, before he could formulate a denial or a threat, Nina answered. She was no longer just a waitress. She was the analyst she used to be, presenting her findings with cold, irrefutable logic. "Bridgewater Capital was a private equity firm," she said, her voice still directed at Harrington. "They specialized in what they called aggressive restructuring. In reality, they were corporate vultures. They orchestrated a hostile takeover of my former employer, a mid-sized tech firm called Novatech Dynamics. They used a series of offshore shell companies to hide their debt-loading tactics. They bought the company, loaded it with unsustainable debt, stripped it of its patents and intellectual property, and then pushed it into bankruptcy. The partners at Bridgewater walked away with hundreds of millions. Over 2,000 employees, myself included, lost our jobs, our pensions, and our reputations overnight." She finally turned her gaze back to Sterling, whose mouth was opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. "Your Project Chimera, Mr. Sterling," she said, the name dripping with disdain. "The tiered acquisition vehicle you were describing to Mr. Harrington. The plan to spin off the manufacturing divisions to a third party to handle restructuring. It's not a new playbook. It's the Bridgewater playbook, word for word." The silence that followed was absolute. The clinking of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation from the rest of the restaurant seemed a world away. In their secluded alcove, a trial was taking place. Nina had laid out her case. The declined card was not the issue, it was the evidence. It was the symptom of a fatal disease, the same reckless, predatory financial engineering that Bridgewater Capital had perfected. It suggested that Sterling was so highly leveraged, so precariously balanced, that a single unexpected margin call from his lenders could freeze his personal accounts. He wasn't a king. He was a gambler on a losing streak, betting everything he had and everything Kennardine was on one last roll of the dice. Lachlan Sterling finally found his voice. It was a strangled, pathetic whisper. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You're a waitress." The insult, which would have crushed her an hour ago, was now meaningless. 3 years ago, I was the senior risk analyst who wrote the report warning my CEO about the vulnerabilities that Bridgewater was exploiting, Nina said. her voice ringing with the clarity of long-suppressed truth. They buried that report, and they buried me along with it. But I never forgot. I never forget a pattern. She looked at Robert Harrington, whose face was a thunderous mask of dawning comprehension. The question you have to ask yourself, Mr. Harrington, she said, her voice softening with a sudden, genuine empathy for the man in his dilemma, is not whether Mr. Sterling can afford to buy your company. The question is whether he can afford not to. Whether this $800 million deal is a conquest or a lifeline. The world in Lachlan Sterling's alcove had shrunk to the space between three people. Everything outside of it had ceased to exist. Sterling, who had commanded the room with his sheer presence just minutes before, now seemed to shrink into the plush leather of the booth. He was exposed, his carefully constructed persona of invincibility stripped away by a woman he wouldn't have trusted to park his car. His empire was built on perception, on the myth of his Midas touch. Nina had just shown that myth to be a fraud, backed by a house of cards. Robert Harrington stared at Nina, his old eyes sharp and discerning. He was a man who had built his career on judging character, on reading the subtle tells in a negotiation that spoke louder than any spreadsheet. He saw no malice in Nina's face, no opportunism. He saw a deep, settled conviction in the quiet, unshakable strength of someone who had survived a fire and was no longer afraid of the flame. He saw truth. He then turned his gaze to Sterling. He saw the beads of sweat on the younger man's temple. He saw the frantic, trapped look in his eyes. He saw the desperate scramble for a rebuttal that wouldn't come. Sterling had no defense because Nina's accusation was not a wild guess. It was a diagnosis. The decline card, the over-leveraged deal structure, the partnership with a notoriously predatory firm, it all painted a picture not of a powerful acquirer, but of a desperate gambler pushing all his chips into the center of the table. A man whose own financial house was in such disarray that he couldn't even pay for dinner. Harrington slowly placed his napkin on the table, the gesture as deliberate and final as a judge lowering a gavel. "Lachlan," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the immense weight of his authority, "is what this young woman says true? Are you partnered with this Bridgewater Capital?" Sterling rallied, attempting to summon his old bluster. "It's a different entity, different management. Robert, this is insane. You can't listen to her. She's a disgruntled former employee with a grudge." "She doesn't seem disgruntled," Harrington observed coolly. "She seems informed. You described your financial partner as an old associate. It seems he has a history you conveniently failed to mention." "This is a smear tactic, a corporate espionage play," Sterling sputtered, grasping at straws. "How do we know she wasn't planted here by a rival?" The accusation was so desperate, so outlandish, that it only served to confirm his guilt. Harrington gave a small, sad shake of his head. "A rival who somehow predicted your personal credit card would be declined at this specific moment, at this specific dinner?" Harrington asked, his voice laced with ice. "No, Lachlan, I don't think so. I think this evening has been very illuminating." Harrington turned his attention back to Nina. He looked at her not as a waitress, but as an equal. "Young woman, what is your name?" "Nina Petrova, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Ms. Petrova," Harrington said, with a nod of profound respect, "you have given me a great deal to consider. You have reminded me of something I seem to have forgotten in the face of compelling numbers." He glanced at Sterling with disdain. "That integrity is not a commodity to be bought and sold. It is the bedrock upon which everything else is built. A company, a legacy." With that, he stood up, his movements fluid and resolute. The weary resignation was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. He was the guardian of Kennardine once more. "Lachlan," he said, looking down at the man who was now, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. "Consider your offer formally and irrevocably withdrawn. I will not be selling my grandfather's company to a man who builds his future on the ruins of other people's lives. And I certainly will not sell it to a man who appears to be on the verge of financial collapse himself." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You and I will have no further communication. Any future correspondence will be between our lawyers." He reached into his own wallet, pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills and placed them on the table. "For the meal," he said. Then he looked at Nina. "And for the consultation." He gave her another nod, a silent acknowledgement of the immense service she had just rendered, and then he turned and walked away. He didn't look back. The $800 million deal was dead, killed not in a boardroom by a team of lawyers, but in a restaurant by a waitress with a good memory and the courage to speak. Lachlan Sterling sat alone in the booth, the wreckage of his ambitions scattered around him. The triumphant dinner had become his public execution. He looked at Nina, his eyes filled with a new expression, a deep, bottomless hatred. "You," he whispered, his voice trembling with rage, "you have just made the biggest mistake of your life. You have no idea who you just crossed. I will destroy you. I will burn down whatever pathetic little life you have until there is nothing left but ash." Nina felt a chill run down her spine. The threat was real. He was a powerful, vindictive man. But as she looked at him, she realized she wasn't afraid. He had already done his worst to her 3 years ago, through his proxies at Bridgewater. She had already been reduced to ash, and from it, she had rebuilt herself into someone stronger. "The difference between you and me, Mr. Sterling," Nina said, her voice soft but unwavering, "is that I have already seen what the bottom looks like. I have a feeling you're about to find out." She picked up the platinum card he had tried to give her and placed it gently on the table in front of him. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the suffocating silence of his own spectacular failure. The immediate aftermath was a blur of controlled chaos. Jean-Pierre Dubois, whose face had been a mask of horror throughout the entire exchange, rushed over to Nina as soon as Lachlan Sterling, face like thunder, stormed out of the restaurant without another word. "Petrova, what have you done?" he hissed, his French accent thick with panic. "You insulted a guest, a billionaire. You are finished, fired." Nina braced herself for the inevitable. She had known this was a possible, even probable outcome. She had willingly sacrificed her job, her sole source of income, for a principle. She felt a strange sense of peace. "I understand, Jean-Pierre," she said calmly. But before he could continue, another waiter approached, holding a portable phone. "Monsieur Dubois, it is for Ms. Petrova." Jean-Pierre looked bewildered. "For her? Who is it?" He said his name is Robert Harrington. The manager's jaw dropped. He looked from the phone to Nina and back again, his mind unable to process the reversal of power dynamics. He wordlessly handed her the phone. Nina took it, her hand surprisingly steady. "Nina Petrova speaking. Ms. Petrova, Robert Harrington here." The voice on the other end was warm and steady. "I apologize for calling you at your place of work, but I didn't want to wait. First, I want to thank you. What you did tonight took a level of courage I have not witnessed in a very long time." "I only told the truth, Mr. Harrington," Nina said quietly. "Truth is a rare and valuable currency in my world," he replied. "Which brings me to my second point. I find myself in sudden and desperate need of someone with your particular skills. Someone with an eye for patterns and the integrity to speak up, regardless of the consequences. My board is going to need a full report on why I just walked away from an $800 million offer. I'd like you to be the one to write it." Nina was stunned into silence. "A report? For the chairman of Kenner Dine?" "Sir, I'm a waitress," she stammered, the words feeling foolish as soon as she said them. "Nonsense," Harrington's voice was firm. "You are a first-rate analyst who has been dealt a bad hand. I pride myself on recognizing talent, Ms. Petrova, and I can assure you it is a crime that yours is being wasted on memorizing wine pairings. Consider this a freelance commission for now. Name your price. I will have my assistant contact you in the morning to arrange the details. Don't worry about your current employer. I'll have a word with Monsieur Dubois and ensure there are no negative repercussions for you." He paused. "Get some rest, Miss Petrova. Tomorrow we begin the work of making sure men like Lachlan Sterling can't do this to anyone else ever again." He hung up. Nina stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. Jean-Pierre was staring at her with a mixture of awe and terror, as if she had just transformed into a different being before his eyes. The world had tilted on its axis. One moment, she was about to be fired. The next, she was being hired by the very man she sought to protect. Meanwhile, the consequences for Lachlan Sterling were swift and brutal. The world of high finance operates on confidence and momentum. Harrington's abrupt withdrawal from the deal was like pulling the keystone from an arch. It didn't just kill the Kennardine acquisition, it sent a shockwave through all of Sterling's ventures. The news hit the pre-market wires by dawn. Harrington walks away from $800 million Sterling offer, citing grave concerns. The language was vague but ominous. Sterling's other lenders, the ones propping up his web of leveraged buyouts, got spooked. If Robert Harrington, the industry's paragon of stability, had found something rotten, they needed to protect their investments. The margin calls began before the opening bell. The consortium of private equity partners for Project Chimera, spooked by the mention of Bridgewater and the sudden collapse of the deal, pulled their funding. The tiered acquisition vehicle Sterling had boasted about collapsed like a punctured lung. The stock price of Sterling Global Acquisitions plummeted by 40% in the first hour of trading. Sterling was trapped in a financial death spiral. Every asset he had was leveraged against another. As each one fell in value, it triggered another margin call, forcing him to sell other assets at a loss, causing their value to fall in a cascading failure that was breathtaking in its speed and ferocity. The cheetah he had so proudly described had devoured itself. By the end of the week, Sterling Global Acquisitions had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Lachlan Sterling, the man with the titanium card and the limitless ambition, was wiped out. His name, once a symbol of power and success, became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and on trading floors. His threat to Nina, to burn down her life, was nothing but the empty howling of a fallen king. He had no power left to burn anything. He had been so focused on destroying others that he failed to realize his own entire empire was built on gasoline-soaked ground, waiting for a single spark. Nina hadn't just been a spark, she had been a lightning strike. 3 months later, Nina Petrova walked through the soaring glass and steel lobby of the Kennardine Industries headquarters. She was not wearing her black waitress uniform. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored business suit that felt both foreign and wonderfully familiar. She carried a leather briefcase containing her first quarterly risk assessment report. After their initial phone call, Robert Harrington had been true to his word, and then some. Her initial freelance report on Lachlan Sterling and Bridgewater Capital had been a masterpiece of forensic accounting and corporate analysis. Using publicly available data and her own deep knowledge of their tactics, she had pieced together a damning indictment of Sterling's predatory business model. She proved conclusively that the Kennardine acquisition was a desperate last-ditch effort to use its stable assets to cover his own catastrophic losses. Harrington had been so impressed that he had created a new position for her at Kennardine, Vice President of Corporate Integrity and Risk Management. It was a role that didn't previously exist, but one he now deemed essential. Her job was to be the company's conscience, its early warning system, to look beyond the numbers on a spreadsheet and analyze the character and ethics of any potential partner, acquisition, or venture. She was, in essence, hired to be the person who could spot the next Lachlan Sterling before he ever got a seat at the table. Her office was on the top floor, not far from Harrington's own. It had a sweeping view of the city, the same view she had once glimpsed from the alcove at the Gilded Quill. But now it felt different. It was no longer a symbol of a world she was locked out of. It was a landscape of possibility. The news of her story, though kept out of the mainstream press by the discreet Harrington, had become something of a legend within the company. They called her the Waitress, but it was a title of respect, a nickname for the woman who had saved them all with a single, courageous act. She had earned the trust of the employees and the board not through a fancy MBA, but through an undeniable display of integrity. She settled in behind her new desk, the scent of fresh coffee replacing the old fragrance of truffle oil. Her mother's medical bills were paid off. She had moved into a new apartment, one with sunlight and space to breathe. But the real wealth was not in the salary or the title. It was the restoration of her name, the quiet satisfaction of her skills being used for something constructive, for protecting a company and its people rather than dismantling them. That afternoon, Robert Harrington stopped by her office. He was looking healthier, more vibrant than he had in years. The weight of the deal had been lifted, and he had found a new energy in safeguarding his company's future. "Nina," he said, his smile genuine, "I just finished reading your quarterly report. It's brilliant and terrifying. I'll sleep a little less soundly tonight, which is precisely why I hired you." "Just doing my job, Mr. Harrington," she smiled back. "Please call me Robert," he insisted. He looked out the window at the sprawling city below. "It's a funny world. A man spends a lifetime building a reputation for good judgment, and in the end, his entire legacy is saved by the sharp eyes of a waitress in a restaurant. I think," Nina said thoughtfully, "it was saved by a man who was willing to listen to that waitress." He nodded, conceding the point. "Perhaps. We saved it together then." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "By the way, I heard from an old friend at the district attorney's office. It seems your report on Bridgewater's activities with Novatech has prompted them to reopen a few old cases. They're looking at Sterling's associate, the head of Bridgewater, for financial fraud. It seems your voice was even more powerful than we thought." A slow, genuine smile spread across Nina's face. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. A small, quiet rebalancing of the scales. As Harrington left, Nina looked around her new office, at the life she had reclaimed. She thought of Lachlan Sterling, a man who had everything and valued nothing beyond the next conquest. He had sought a wealth of billions, a fortune built on a foundation of sand. She had found a different kind of wealth, one that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet or frozen by a bank. It was the wealth of a clear conscience, the satisfaction of meaningful work, and the unshakable knowledge that a single voice, speaking the truth at the right moment, could be more powerful than all the money in the world, and it was a fortune that no one could ever take from her again. Nina's story is a powerful reminder that heroes aren't defined by their job titles, but by their choices. She was overlooked and underestimated, yet she held on to the one thing the powerful men around her had misplaced: her integrity. In a world that often celebrates the ruthless, her story shows that true strength lies in courage, observation, and the willingness to speak truth to power, even when your voice is shaking. She didn't just save a company, she reclaimed her own life and delivered justice for thousands. What do you think? Was Nina's action an act of heroism or a reckless gamble? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of quiet courage and stunning justice moved you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own power, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more true life stories that will leave you breathless. Thank you for watching.